I am just groggy from that.
Really?
Like, I'm still in the camp of, I wonder if that's going to change with a couple more years down the road. And by the way, not live on YouTube. Alex, anything there? Just so you know, we're going to keep going because this is the podcast form as well. There we are. We're up and live now. But I'm with you in the whole sleep situation because, like, for you, like, you really buy into sleep. I don't as much. Like, I know that you're a guy who likes your 8 hours when you can get it. I can't believe what you did on Friday. That was wild. Like, we were a part of that. You coming in here, joining me pretty late for the podcast, but I don't know how many times, like, I just saw your name pop up on social media, just like, you know, article here, podcast here. Like, the deadline was a crazy day. How good did it feel to at least take some of Saturday off and just chill? Like, it was a great feeling for me.
It was great, but it was tough timing too, because my barber was about to leave this week on a trip. So Saturday was the last possible day for me to get a cut booked in. My car was in maintenance, so I had an hour and 10-minute commute each way via transit. So that kind of was annoying to deal with it, but I was like, I have to look fresh. So, I mean, I guess I can't complain about it. It's something I wanted to do, but it wasn't quite as restful. I'm looking forward to another busy day today, and then the middle of the week, I'm going to be taking easier.
Yeah, that's always good. And now we're live on YouTube. People can see Harvin's in here today on Monday. No Quads today. Do you know why? Do you know why Quads isn't here today?
Yes, I do.
Because he got a puppy. I say Quads is on Paw Patrol today. He is watching his puppy. He's still a couple days into it. Rumor on the street is he did not get more than 2 hours of consecutive sleep on Friday with that puppy, because that thing was up and ready to go. I've been saying it for a long time. He's going to be pissing everywhere.
That's a nightmare.
But no, apparently last night was better for him. The dog slept a little bit longer, which is good news. So I don't know if his little pup is watching here today. Quads might even have us up on YouTube right now, but he should be back tomorrow. I think we'll see what happens. I might have to go solo one of these days here, which I don't know how that's going to go. But let's dive into some Canucks talk. I apologize to people on YouTube. You missed I think a pretty good little ramble off the top, but you'll hear that on the podcast. All right, let's dive into some Canucks stuff. I want to start with Quinn Hughes. I think it was kind of a bigger story that Canucks fans could actually get excited about, which is something that we haven't had for quite a while from Canucks fans. But the story of Quinn Hughes being the fastest defenseman all time in NHL history to hit 200 assists. We can get this graphic up here. This is pretty incredible to see Quinn Hughes on this list. Not only on this list, but at the top of this list for being the quickest defenseman to 200 assists in the NHL in the history of the league. Like, it's damn impressive when you actually say it out loud and see the graphic. It is wild that we're talking about names here like Brian Leetch, Bobby Orr, Sergei Zubov, Paul Coffey, Al McInnes. Quinn Hughes is above them all and was quicker than all of them to 200 assists. He beat Brian Leetch by one game. How impressive is this stat, Harm?
Extremely impressive. I think it's a reflection not only of his talent, but how advanced he was, in the sense that as soon as he hit the NHL as a rookie, 20 years old, he was number one defenseman right from day one. If you remember the first game that he played against the Edmonton Oilers, I was there in Edmonton. He was matched up against Connor McDavid, who was playing with Leon Draisaitl on the line. Hard match. I mean, imagine that as your welcome to the NHL moment. You're fresh off playing college hockey, right? And you're used to that level of competition. And now it's like, all right, buddy, paired up with Chris Tanev, NHL debut, McDavid and Draisaitl, have fun, right? So, of course, there were some learning curves along the way. I remember that first game, there was at least one or two plays where I think Hughes got burned defensively, but then the next time they played the Oilers, he defended Draisaitl so much better and had picked up little tips and tricks of how to use his mobility, stick, and angling, as opposed to trying to win on body position, which is battle he's always going to lose against somebody like Draisaitl. But yeah, from then on, he was PP1 right away, putting up elite point totals.
Well, not right away. If you remember Jason Botchford, how long it
took
I'm
talking about the 1920 season.
Okay, I was going to say, to get
there
Hughes
was definitely
on the
a big campaign. It took a while. I think there might have even been a lag period, maybe in 1920, maybe a couple games where before he got him on PP1. But yeah, it was incredible to see a defenseman like, a lot of times you'll see a gradual buildup, right? With forwards, with defensemen. But with Hughes from day one, he was already a number 1D. To do that at 20 is enormously impressive. And that's why when in his sophomore year, he had that down year defensively, people on the East were sort of tarnishing his defensive reputation and sort of going, oh, is he? And I'm like, he's a 21-year-old sophomore defender. Look at what he did at the age of 20. People are throwing out Tyson Barrie. No, is he just going to regress back to being a Barrie? And I'm like, guys, do you not realize how special it is to do what he did at 20? I mean, look at Rasmus. Look at how long it took Rasmus Dahlin, right?
To figure it out, yeah.
Number 1 draft pick, and he's a Norris contender this year. But Hughes was better than Dahlin right off the hop. 100%, without a shred of doubt. It took until there was a point with Dahlin under Ralph Kruger where people were wondering if Dahlin was a bust, if he'd ever be a number 1 potential or number 1 defenseman. So he's obviously reached that ceiling, and one can certainly argue that Dahlin's better than Hughes today. But for Hughes to have hit the ground running right away, I think it speaks to how elite and special of a talent he is. We've never seen a defenseman anywhere close to that in franchise history.
Yeah, I think it's funny that you brought up the kind of trial by fire coming in and having that matchup against, you know, the Draisaitl McDavid line. Cause like I saw this video the other day, actually, and I thought it was so wild because it was less than 2 years ago when Jack Rathbone made his NHL debut. And he had that 2-on-1 against him with McDavid and Draisaitl coming down. So it almost just feels like that's how you officially become a Vancouver Canucks defenseman, is like you have to defend McDavid and Draisaitl. Once you pass that, like you can stick in the NHL for a little bit. But the other thing about Hughes is this stat popped up, and it was very interesting, obviously, seeing him be the fastest in the NHL history to 200 assists. But the other thing that was very interesting is Greg Wyshynski's, he wrote an article, and this isn't, I don't think this is his opinion.
Not his opinion.
This is the list that he had when he polled NHL executives and players. And it was about the top 10 defensemen in the NHL. And if you read the article, like I said, this isn't Wish's thoughts. I think this is just from him polling these type of people. Quinn Hughes doesn't show up on that top 10 list of defensemen. That's a little surprising. I think it depends, because if you're polling guys from the NHL, you're polling executives and players. It's hard for these people to watch Quinn Hughes on a consistent basis on the West Coast, right? This 10 o'clock start time, it makes it difficult. I understand that. You only get to see him for a handful of games, but I do think there's enough national coverage, like when he goes out east, when the Canucks go out east, and you kind of have the Hughes Bowl, like you have that type of thing.
Yeah.
You have him against Toronto. He seems to always have these very good games against the teams in the East. So I was a little surprised to not see him on this list, especially when you have names like you brought up Rasmus Dahlin. That's one that you can definitely slide in there. Cale Makar, obviously. Adam Fox has been great. Roman Josi for the years that has passed over. But when I look at this list, I am a little surprised to see a Dougie Hamilton or a Charlie McAvoy over Quinn Hughes on this list. Those are the two names that I look at this list, and that surprises me above Hughes. Is there another name on this list that kind of shouldn't be there and Hughes should be there instead?
Okay, yeah. So I wanted to just start and let's go through the list and sort of be like, okay, that guy makes sense, that guy doesn't, right? Mm-hmm. So number 1, Cale Makar makes sense, right? Look at what he did in the playoffs. Adam Fox, he also has a Norris Trophy under his belt. No problems there. Victor Hedman, amazing, no problems there. Roman Josi, he's consistently been in the Norris conversation, elite point scorer
for years. Years and years and years.
No problem there. McAvoy, see, I can actually see the argument for McAvoy ahead of Hughes, despite the fact that he doesn't have elite point totals, because for a big chunk of his career, he didn't get the power play one time because of Torrey Krug. And even outside of the point totals, he's measured purely on defense, he's one of the top probably 5 shutdown defensemen in the league. So it's like, if you're a high-end point producer, even if you're not elite, but you're able to combine that with on pure defense being a top 5 shutdown defenseman.
Yep.
I'll buy that argument, right? And that's the similar sort of reason behind why I'm like, okay, Mira Heiskanen too. I can see Heiskanen above Hughes, even though it's not by a lot, because same sort of thing. For a long time, Klingberg was taking the power play 1 opportunities. Heiskanen's had an offensive breakout this year, and it's like when you combine it with the size, reach, Again, similar to McAvoy, because I did a breakdown last season looking at the best defensive defensemen in the NHL, and Heiskanen and McAvoy both came up on pure defense. So I'm like, okay, if you can combine those two elements, I can buy it. Erik Karlsson, I'm like, this season, yes, but you look at what he's done before. The last couple of years, he hasn't been in that territory, so you get into that tricky range of like.
I think with this poll being done this point in the season, he's absolutely on the top 10. Though.
Where I start to disagree is, and okay, sure, I guess based off this year, you can also make the case for Dahlin. Definitely, I'm like Dougie Hamilton. Really,
that's that one I can pretty easily put Hughes above.
Like he's had a great year. Don't get me wrong. He has 18 goals, almost near a point per game. But last year he was such a disappointment, and I know he had trouble with injuries, but he was around half a point per game. He's also not great defensively, so it's not as if you can look at him and make some sort of case for his defense being superior, and Hughes's offensive production is superior as well. So I don't see the case for that at all. The best way, let me frame it to you this way, right? A couple years ago, when Hamilton was a pending UFA, the Carolina Hurricanes, instead of re-signing Hamilton, decided that they would replace him by signing Tony DeAngelo for cheap. Think about what that says, that the Carolina Hurricanes could look at Dougie Hamilton and go, we can replace this guy with a near league minimum reclamation project type player. And it worked for them. They didn't really skip a beat because playing with Jacob Slavin, he's that good. And they were just able to get the power play production from DeAngelo. So he didn't move the needle enough at 5-5.
I think what's interesting here when I look at this list, and I think you did a good job breaking down the list there, but I also take into account of actual impact on a singular team, right? Like Cale Makar makes a massive difference for the Colorado Avalanche moving the puck. I think you can say a lot about a lot of these guys on this list that are similar. But I really think that like the pressure on Quinn Hughes to be a primary puck mover on the Vancouver Canucks is massive. And it needs to be taken into account here, because think about how many players, and defensemen, I mean, specifically, you can trust on the Vancouver Canucks to move the puck.
Just him.
It's Quinn Hughes. I really do think it's Quinn Hughes. And I know that a lot of these points come on the power play, and that's something that Quinn Hughes has been doing throughout his whole career. No surprise there. But I think aside from that, when you start to mention like the McAvoy and the stuff that isn't going to show up on the score sheets, it isn't going to show up, in the stats every time you see it, or same with kind of Jacob Slavin or even Heiskanen as well. But
I'd also take Hughes over Slavin.
Yeah, I would,
even though I like Slavin. Like Slavin is good. He's an elite defenseman. Don't get me wrong, but it's not. I don't think he's had the same level of impact that Hughes has had.
That's exactly it. It's the level of impact of a defenseman. I think Quinn Hughes, there's no argument he's a top 10 level of impact defenseman on a team.
Yeah, I think he'd be toward the end of my top 10 list, is the way I'd put it. Somewhere in that like 7 to 10 range for sure. Because looking at Slavin, for example, he hasn't even been able to, one of the Hurricanes, like people will rightfully give him so much praise for being one of the best defensive defensemen in the league. And that, okay, he can also put up decent point totals, but here's what has let the Hurricanes down in consecutive years in the playoffs: an inability to produce in the power play. Well, shouldn't your number one defenseman, in theory, if we're talking about the elites of the elites, shouldn't he be able to effectively quarterback a power play? That's not Jacob Slavin, right? They went out and they've cycled through DeAngelo. They brought in Brent Burns. He wasn't quite the answer. And then that's where recently at the deadline, the Hurricanes went out and acquired Shane Gostisbehere to kind of be a power play quarterback for them.
Fill that role, yeah.
Slavin doesn't check off that box, right? So how can you, like, people will point at someone like Hughes, and in previous years they'll be like, oh, like he doesn't kill penalties enough, or he's not defensively sound enough. He doesn't check all the boxes. Well, it's like Slavin doesn't check all the boxes either.
Yeah.
Even though you may look at him and go, that's a more rare, like people like the idea of, oh, like execs, especially the idea of, oh, big defender, right? So, but it's like he doesn't check all the boxes, right?
Yeah, I think with him, with Slavin, it's the idea of he's the best defensive defenseman in the league. And a lot of GMs and executives or players will latch on to that. And that's why he keeps showing up on these lists. And don't get me wrong, you're right. It's a massive thing to have on your team. If you are well known around the league as the best defending defenseman, I mean, that's going to be tough to go.
Slavin would still be in my top 15 again. Don't get me
Right.
wrong, but he's not ahead of Hughes for me.
Yeah.
And then like look at some of the names that were on these honorable mentions, right? Like that got votes ahead of Hughes because Hughes didn't get any votes.
Oh, one vote, yeah.
Like you're looking at Hampus Lindholm, where Lindholm's had a good season, but on a much better Boston team, and like nobody talked about him before this year. Nobody. So you're telling me off half a season worth of a sample on a good team that you're automatically going to say Lindholm is better than Hughes. Well, why, like if that was the case, why wasn't every team in on the bidding for Hampus Lindholm at the deadline last year, right?
There you go.
So there's him, there's Devon Taves. I really like Devon Taves, but he plays with Cale Makar on the Colorado Avalanche. Like,
I mean, Pietrangelo got some votes. I've seen Drew Doughty get some votes as well. I think that's a lot of
even Zach Werenski.
You know what
like,
it shows me sometimes seeing some of these polls, and I think you see a lot of these with the NHL.
Mo Seider got votes ahead of Quinn Hughes.
Yeah,
come on.
I love Mo Seider, but
I love Mo
Seider,
but come on, he's not there yet.
I think a lot of these names, or a few of them anyways, like Pietrangelo, Doughty, I think this kind of shows like, hey, a lot of people like really still value the star name of a defenseman as well, right? Maybe why Erik Karlsson got some votes at this point, and though he's had a ridiculous season, I think you can make an argument for this year. But to see Doughty and Pietrangelo and Seider, like you mentioned, to see them get votes over Quinn Hughes, who you said didn't get one vote, that does shock me quite a bit.
It did. I started thinking about why.
But it's a slight. It's what you see. Like this poll
yeah, I mean,
was
we're
probably
not offended,
no,
right? Like
this
it's just
poll was probably
interesting, right?
It's probably done in Toronto, right? Like this is what
well,
it feels like.
Greg's not based out of Toronto.
Well,
so.
you know what I'm saying. It's a damn East Coast thing again here. But I did see something come in here from Chris, who said, I need to watch some Hronek highlights. Who's watched a bunch of Hronek tape over the last week or so? This guy, Harmon Dial. Let's talk about that.
One thing I wanted to quickly
Sure.
mention about why I think Hughes didn't land on this list. I think because of his size and because of that 2021 season he had, immediately there were like he got cast with that defensive liability label, which it takes a long time for like once a reputation or a label is created, it takes a long time for that to be shed again.
Bingo.
So I remember when I was doing, for example, agents polls, and I'd talked to a couple execs as well at the time trying to project Hughes' next contract. A lot of people were legitimately like, "Ooh, I think you got to be careful about how much you commit to Quinn Hughes long term." And I'm like, "Really?" But that was the perception that's been created, right? And so I still think people, because of that, haven't noticed the defensive strides that he's taken the last couple of seasons because, as you mentioned, he's on the West Coast and you don't see him as often. So I'd hypothesize that that's the reason.
Definitely a reason I can get behind there as well. I'm curious, and I think we'll get to this at some point before. Like, I'm very curious to see what a pairing of Quinn Hughes and Filip Hronek will look like. But I just want to open it up to you because you watched a ton. You just wrote about it for The Athletic there. You didn't put him in your top 10 defensemen, though, Filip Hronek, but you did spend a lot of time watching him. I found it interesting that you immediately, kind of off the top of the article, addressed the questions about if Hronek has some defensive warts and what he looks like as a one-on-one defender. Looked like from the way you wrote about it and kind of placed some video in there, like you were somewhat impressed, I would say, from his one-on-one defending ability.
For sure.
Which is, by the way, it's funny because I could bring up the shot. I could bring up him moving the puck. But the first thing I wanted to talk about, and the first thing you mentioned in the article, was his defending. I'm curious why you went that direction.
Because it was the most surprising part, right? Sort of, I just mentioned the idea that it takes a while to shed reputations and labels. The story around Hronek, the way he was described for a really long time, was offensive defender who has significant defensive warts. And don't get me wrong, that reputation earlier in his career was earned, right? He was logging these huge minutes for the Red Wings on some bad rebuilding teams. He was a defensive liability at times, right? On the ice for way more goals against than he was goals for, showing up the same way in terms of the shots and scoring chances against. But he's had a breakout year this season, and watching him play, and in my process, I try to be very meticulous about, okay, if I'm watching games here, I want to make sure that I don't just like watch 5 games in a row, like in a stretch of like March, right? I made sure that I watched games that were Like I watched a game in October, one in November, one from like 2 weeks ago, interspersed it throughout the calendar year. So I wouldn't be caught in like, ooh, he's having a 5-game heater playing the best hockey, or like he's having a 5-game drought. And I also looked at the individual game logs of trying to find games where it's like, he had an excellent game by the underlying metrics. Let's see what that looks like. He had a really rough game by the underlying metrics. Let's look at that. He had some average games. Let's look at that. And the thing that consistently stood out was he was totally fine defensively. Like he was pretty competent there. Definitely a significant step up from what I've noticed in terms of his defensive awareness, how he's constantly scanning, checking, shoulder checking, looking to take away the cross-seam pass. He took it away on a number of occasions. And don't get me wrong, I don't think he's the second coming of Chris Tanev or anything. There were definitely instances where I watched him and went, okay, like I can see there's work to be done there. Like he's not the most agile defender off the rush, which will be interesting to see, but he's extremely competitive, right? Like he's average size, but the one thing I noticed is when he's able to play, like when he has a tight gap, right? He's really aggressive on closing and hounding the puck carrier and using a combination of a stick and body to be able to create that change in possession, to be able to break that play up. And I saw him do that. Some of the clips I highlighted were against Boldy, Kaprizov, Stamkos. Yeah. Like he was doing it against some legit competition, even though generally speaking this year, he's mostly played traditional second pair matchups, which I think is part of the story as well, is that he's had this breakout now that he's played in a second pair role behind Seider instead of being leaned on as the number one. But yeah, he was solid in that regard. He very rarely did I see him make a bad read and put himself way out of position. He just seemed like a solid all around 2A defenseman, which is, I guess, the biggest takeaway was he's not this sort of offense. He's not this offensive D with defensive warts.
So here's my question about that then, because you can have a couple different options. We have the poll up right now on YouTube asking if you think that Hronek and Hughes should play together or play separately. The role that you watched him in a lot this season was a second pairing guy in a second pairing role. And you can use this to kind of relative of where he is in a lineup. As a top pairing guy, you don't think he's a dynamic, high-end puck mover. What about as a second pairing guy? Did you think that he was moving the puck well as that kind of role when you're not matching up against the best forwards? And I think when you aren't matching up against other teams' top lines, you do have a lot more opportunities to move the puck out of your own zone, just simply because top lines spend a lot of time in your zone.
Well, that was the other surprise, right? Was he's a solid puck mover, don't get me wrong, but he's not flashy, he's not dynamic, and
doesn't scream primary puck mover.
Yes, right? So he's competent, he's solid, but I wouldn't use a word like high-end to describe what he can do. Like, he'll make some good plays with the puck, but for example, Corey Schneider's tracking data, Hronek was fourth among Red Wings defensemen this season in terms of possession, defensive zone exits with possession per 60 minutes. He was behind Seider, Jake Wallman, who's a fantastic skater, and even behind Ole Matter, right? So when I would watch these tapes, it wasn't as if every dump is coming and it's like the Wings are funneling the puck to Hronek and expecting him to lead the breakout. It was interesting because on the one hand, he skates well, he's smooth. So when forecheckers give him space, he likes to carry the puck and he's confident and he's poised doing that. He can even activate up on the rush. But what was interesting was when forecheckers apply a lot of pressure, it's not that he panics or necessarily makes mistakes, but he doesn't have the explosive acceleration in his first step or two to be able to separate and outskate guys the way Quinn Hughes can, right? So it's like when pressure's on him, he needs support options near him, whether it's his defense partner, whether it's a winger or a center coming deep. And if those support outlets are there, he'll hit those targets efficiently. But if they're not there, he's not afraid to a lot of times go boards and out, flip it out, right? So that's why I think part of his effectiveness as a puck mover is going to be contingent on the infrastructure around him, because if he has a lot of support, I look at his skills and it's like he can make a decent first pass. He skates reasonably well. He's still mobile. Like, he'll excel, but if you're expecting him to be a wizard and do it all on his own. Like, that's not going to be the answer. And that's why, in terms of a role on a second pair, that's why my overall takeaway was like, I think he's a really good number 3. I don't quite think he's a number 2. And like, the way I think of a number 3 is, okay, if you want him to caddy on the top pair with a legit number 1 like Hughes, he'll do that well. If you want him to drive a second pair, he can do that, but he needs another, like,
top 4.
He needs another top 4 partner,
he
right?
Can't carry a guy into the top 4. He's going to need
exactly that. Right. Okay. So you saw, like, this season, for example, he played with Ole Mata, who's a fringe, like, barely top 4 caliber, and it was fine, right? Like, that pair was fine. It wasn't great, but it was effective enough. Got the job done. But then they put Ben Sherratt next to him, right? And they like struggled. They really struggled recently, and I think Hronek was controlling like 40% of shots, scoring chances and goals. Like, it wasn't really working. And that's not a knock on Hronek. It's just Sherratt had those same results with Seider. Yeah. The takeaway there is, in my opinion, I want Hronek on a second pair, because I think this D is still too thin to where I still believe that the Canucks should maximize the amount of ice time that they have at least one of Hughes or Hronek on the ice for. Especially because Hughes, regardless of if he's playing with Hronek or another partner like a Bear or whatever, like, that pair is still going to drive really good results. Yeah. Whereas the second pair has been such a tire fire that I think you need another stabilizing force. But I'd be careful of thinking that, we're going to slot OEL, for example, in that role. And if OEL plays the way he has this season, like, it's not going to magically change things. It'll help, obviously, but Hronek will need help around him, which is totally reasonable. He's not a miracle worker. He's not Quinn Hughes.
So what? Corey has a funny comment here into the YouTube. Says, I shouldn't have read Harm's article already. They probably just knew all the information you just dropped there. But one thing you did, I think you touched on this in the article, but didn't spend a lot of time. What would a pairing of Hronek and Hughes look like? What would they do well? What would be something that you might have a worry about? And now that you've seen Hronek do this, and the way that you just described him to me is like, he's going to need support to be a top pairing guy. He will need that support. Yeah. He can't carry it himself. You have one of the best support, options in the NHL as a defensive partner with Quinn Hughes there. How good could that pairing look together if that's the way they go?
They'd be great. They'd be fantastic. I mean, the one takeaway I had was, even if you play them split, you definitely want to play them together in offensive situations when you're trailing, because when you look at Hughes and the list of partners that he's had over his career, he's never had anybody as effective offensively as
because talk to me about the shot. Talk to me about the shot.
He's got a really good shot. Like, he can let the one-time bomb go from the point, but he can also walk in and try and snipe a puck, which is pretty cool to watch. And he's a dual threat in the sense that he's got smart instincts, right? Like, sometimes you have offensive defenders where it's like, guy's got a cannon of a shot, but he can't, like, that's all he does, right? Like, he can't make plays. He doesn't know how to use the threat of a shot in a way to set his teammates up. Yeah. Which is one thing that I saw from Hronek, and I included a clip of it in the article, where there was one example in the power play where it's like he's loading up for a bomb. He fakes the bomb, and then it's like a slap pass to the left flank for Perron, who hits a one-timer goal. That's where you look at Hronek, and I'm like, he can play off of Hughes, right? He's not going to cannibalize things, right? Because that would be the worry, is if you have a shot first defenseman, you don't want him all of a sudden just like hogging the puck and
almost like stopping the dynamics things that Hughes does in the off. Like, it doesn't.
I don't worry about that.
Yeah, it doesn't need to immediately end with a slap shot one timer. Like,
exactly,
you can do more.
Right? Like, so he's versatile in that sense. He's versatile offensively. I think they'd be great together offensively. And initially, again, because of some of the defensive concerns earlier in Hronek's career, I was thinking like, okay, would that pair work defensively per se? Based off of what I saw from Hronek in the tape I watched, I wouldn't worry about them defensively. I think Hronek is perfectly competent. Again, I think he's more at this stage based off how he's playing this season, right? Because I can't judge him based off his past or whatever, right?
Fair enough.
Based off what I saw from him this season, he looks like a jack of all trades, sort of more all-around defenseman. And so there's no doubt that that they'd be great together.
All right. Here's the question for you then. Same question that we just asked in the YouTube. If you're the coach, are you playing them together starting next season?
Splitting them personally.
Splitting them?
I mean, you look at, for example, and this is a pair that I didn't think would work on paper just because I was like, do they check off too many of the similar stylistic boxes? Like you look at Hughes and Bear, they have been dominant in controlling shots, possession, and the goals for and against ratio. I haven't checked the exact numbers in a couple weeks here, but they were really, really effective together. And that's not looking at Bear and being like, oh my God, look at how good Ethan Bear is.
Right.
That's more of a compliment to Hughes and saying all he needs is a competent partner, and he's going to put up really good results for that pair, right? So if you look at a scenario where it's like, regardless of who he's playing with, as long as he has a halfway competent partner, a Hughes pair is going to drive, let's say 55 to 60% of the goal share.
Right.
At 5-on-5. So it's like the upgrade from Bear to Hronek, right? Like if you're already at a 55, 60% goal share, how much higher can you really get,
is
right?
It a compound loss.
Do you have to, are there diminishing gains to like stacking that, right? Because look, if you had a deep D core, I wouldn't hesitate. I'd go Hughes and Hronek, absolutely
win
best
that
partner,
battle every night.
Win that battle every night. They're going to be dominant. Great. But the problem with the Canucks right now is their second pair has been such a disaster that I think from the team's perspective, in terms of what can help them most in turning around their 5-on-5 play, they need somebody to stable. I think you gain more from having Hronek stabilize the second pair, hopefully with another halfway competent partner that, I guess, if you're retooling and trying to win now, then that means you are going to be in the market for the top 4 defensemen. If you can get that sort of piece, even if he's a halfway decent option next to Hronek, I think you need to worry about I'm more worried about the second pair in fulfilling that need before I am finding the right partner for Hughes, because Hughes can still deliver elite results.
Yeah. And you brought it up like, hey, there's a lot of opportunity here to, I think specifically this season, like let them play together this season. Or at least try it and see what it looks like, because maybe that's something that you just go to when you're down a goal or when you're tied up, you're late in games, when you're kind of getting rid of the third pairing on your team, and you're just kind of rolling with the top guys. Like, I'm curious to see. I think it gives them options in the top 4. It just feels like you have 2 roads here, right? You can be like, hey, we can shore up our top pairing, or we can at least set up our top 4 for success by splitting them up. I think that's the 2 roads.
It's not even shoring up your top pair. It's like, it's trying to bolster the top pair from good to elite.
Yeah.
Which is great if you have the depth to be able to, over the rest of your lineup, to be able to afford that upgrade. And I just don't. I think the gain from on the second pair from disastrous to competent would yield the team better results than as opposed to going from good to elite for the top pair, if that makes sense.
Agree. It's about time we talk about a top 4 in Vancouver. So let's dive into our next thing on the ticker here. What to watch for. Canucks Preds. We'll do a quick little hit here. Brendan Batchelor has a pair of tweets that I want to get to tonight for a couple things I want to watch. First up, Archer Seelovs looks like he's going to get the start tonight. He was the first goalie off the ice. Rick Tocchet later confirmed it. You were down there, weren't you, Harm?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I was talking to Ryan Johnson, who we'll get to in just a minute here. But Seelovs in net. What do you expect tonight? Anything?
I'm excited to see. I mean, of course, another game for Seelovs. It's always a great opportunity to see
party.
Whether he could even.
Have you heard the Artie Party music?
No, I haven't.
When we talk Seelovs,
oh hell yeah,
Artie Party time all the time. So Archer Seelovs gets a start tonight.
Well, I walked into the dressing room after morning skate, and the first thing I hear is Artie Party. So that was pretty funny.
We do love a good Artie Party.
Like, it's great. It's important to see what he can do, because imagine if he could be. Now, I don't think this is ideal necessarily. I would prefer for him to maybe play as much as possible. But look, if he's competent right away and Ian Clark thinks that he can be your backup next season, and if you don't have a lot of faith in Spencer Martin, and you're looking at goalie market, it's not league minimum to find an affordable backup anymore. You look at Seelovs and go, could he back up next year?
Bingo.
So
still feels early to me, but
it feels, like I said, it's early for me. But you at least can't, like, it's not a totally crazy thing to wonder. I mean, imagine, I don't think it'll happen, but Imagine if he just goes like every time he gets a shot in the NHL now, and maybe he doesn't get many more shots when Delia is healthy again. But if he's
very good,
like, I don't know, what if he is that answer?
Sure.
Or at least what if you can go into next season thinking that, okay, we'll have Martin as our soft number 2, knowing that if he falters, Silovs is the 3 and we can flip him up from Abbotsford.
Yep. I think it's at the point right now where, if you remember where Thatcher Demko was when his camp pushed to get him to the NHL from the AHL, I think you might be ahead of that point going into next season, or at a similar spot, maybe earlier into the season. Because if you remember, I believe it was January when Demko got called up from Utica and jumped in and started playing behind Jacob Markstrom. I think you could see something similar here, but I just don't want to get too far ahead of myself, because I do think a lot for Silovs' development is still riding on an AHL playoff run. I think that's going to be majorly important to his development, but also coming into next season with the idea of being an AHL starter. I think that's also a big part of development right now, because I do want to see him play more games, simply because of, the Mikey DiPietro thing where he didn't play any games in COVID. Silovs played less games than Mikey DiPietro that year.
Yeah.
So he needs to play some games. And I mean, there's a lot of things he's worked on, and obviously getting that time with Ian Clark was great. And getting this time with him is great right now. I just think that games. That's what you need to see from the Artie Party man himself. Fire it up in chat. I see the chat going nuts for Artie Party. We love it. All right. The other thing I wanted to bring up we'll keep it going in the background. The other thing I want to bring up from a Brendan Batchelor tweet earlier today. What do you think about the Kravtsov Podkolzin duo? Because they're going to be playing with Sheldon Dries tonight as their center. What do you think of that pairing? I'll start here. I just think that it's been fun to watch Kravtsov. Like, it just feels like he really cares about like backing up Podkolzin. Like, you didn't see this in New York. A lot of people called him like soft and being an outside player. Like, Kravtsov's diving in there to stick up for his boy Vasily. Like, these two seem to very much like playing with each other. I like the duo. They've do very much like them.
And I'd like to see them get more minutes. Tocchet mentioned it today after the skate that he was looking at the ice time totals, looking at how heavily he was riding Pedersen, Miller, Hughes, and all these names, looking at the lack of, ice time for Kravtsov and Podkolzin, going, I need to bump these guys in a little bit more in terms of the ice time. I also saw, I can't remember if this was on Twitter or somewhere else, somebody was like, we need to find the Canucks need to find a Russian center for them and call it, and unite the vodka line.
That would very much help.
But yeah, it's fun. I mean, the Canucks at this point are simply looking at who's part of the equation for next season, right? You've got the surplus of wingers. Who can provide value for you next season? Who's part of the long-term solution? And you've got a lot of guys that are sort of trying to prove themselves as part of the pecking order, especially because, look, you'd imagine in the offseason the Canucks are going to be looking to find penalty killers.
Yes.
Right? So not all of these guys are going to get an opportunity next season. Right? Like,
when the hell are they going to put Podkolzin out there, though, man? That's what I've been wondering lately. Like, I think it should have been since he's been here in the NHL. I'm curious, when the hell are we going to see Podkolzin kill penalties?
I was thinking about that too. Like, I think I went on a rant. I did a rant on it in the Vancast where I was like, you're 32nd in the league in penalty killing. This season doesn't matter. You look at Podkolzin, he hasn't been able to produce enough offensively. If he doesn't hit his offensive ceiling, you want him to be able to provide value in other ways. He was billed as a good defensive player in junior, high work rate, good physical tools. He's got work to do defensively now, but why not give him a shot? Why not develop him in that way? Because otherwise he'll get to next season. You'll be going, the playoff push is back on. We can't afford to try this guy, Podkolzin, that's never played on the PK before. It's too much of a risk. Like, you've got nothing to lose here. Why not? Right. So,
And you know what? They went down when he went down to the AHL. They didn't make him the first guy over the boards, but he did kill some penalties.
But it doesn't matter. That's not even close to the same. Like, in the AHL, your top power play threat that you're trying to defend against is what, like a Sheldon Dries? Right? Whereas in the NHL, Edmonton Oilers roll into town and you got to defend McDavid, Draisaitl, Nugent Hopkins, all of these guys. Colorado comes, you got to defend McKinnon, Rantanen. Like, come on. It's not comparable. at all. But Nikolai
Big jump.
Goldobin used to kill penalties in Utica, right? It's
guy's got a lot of tool belts, a lot of tools in the tool belt. Nikolai Goldobin, looking good. KHL All-Star 3 years in a row. All right, let's move on to Aidan McDonough here, because by the way, Canucks game tonight 7:30. A little bit of a later start tonight.
Oh, 7:30.
Yeah, you're gonna be out by then. All right, we got Preds in town 7:30 tonight. Aidan McDonough stuff. Let's pull this up. I had a good chat with Ryan Johnson today. We talked about a lot of different things, and I'll probably spend a couple days here I'll have some articles out for Canucks Army, but the Aidan McDonough one is up right now, because throughout the years of Aidan McDonough being a Vancouver Canuck prospect, which by the way is from the 2019 NHL draft, so he's been around for a few years, and I think Ryan Johnson has kind of been the guy who I would look at as throughout McDonough's time as a Canucks prospect, I'd say that RJ is probably the most consistent contact. Because listen, there's been different GMs, there's been different development staff come in. Ryan Johnson has been the consistent one for him. And I do want to read this quote from Ryan Johnson today about Aidan McDonough. And this is when we talked earlier today. So here's the quote from Ryan Johnson. "There was never a conversation of pushing him to sign. Aidan told us, I want to go back to finish up. I want to get stronger. I want another off season to improve my game. There was never once a conversation of we think you should sign now. It's always been about supporting and understanding Aidan's decision and why it is important to him. We have supported him and continue to develop and build that relationship. We hope Aidan finishes up and then he's ready to get on board and join the group. It's been a long runway with Aidan, and he's an outstanding player, but he's also an outstanding person. Our development staff has worked extremely close with him. I've spent a ton of time with Aidan at development camps, talking to him after games and seeing him in Boston." So I also heard from a couple different sources, and I put this out, I think, on the weekend, or maybe I talked about it on the podcast a little bit on Friday. I think I did, yeah. But when I said 60-40 that he signs to the Canucks, I had a couple people reach out very quickly and say that. RJ didn't confirm that there's a 100% chance of them scoring, but I do find it interesting that they didn't trade his rights at the deadline. They didn't. I think they have a positive feeling. Like a lot of what I've heard over the past few weeks is a very positive feeling towards McDonough signing with the Canucks, and the fact that they didn't move from the trade deadline, I think that is another positive.
You'd have to be confident,
yeah,
in order to,
because otherwise you were losing this guy for nothing. So feeling good about that. I know some people have asked about some NCAA free agents as well. I'll quickly just touch on that. You can sign NCAA players today. Like today is the day where you can start to sign them. Just the problem is that a lot of these schools, specifically the good schools, they made it to the playoffs. So they have their conference playoffs. Some of them are starting as soon as Wednesday. Most of them are starting next weekend. So it's kind of a day by day thing right now. I think the earliest we can start to see someone like McDonough, I think his game actually is on Wednesday. So McDonough could be in could sign with the Canucks as soon as Thursday. That's if Northeastern gets eliminated, but they're kind of projected to win the Hockey East. They did win the regular season. So it's kind of a game-by-game thing that we're going to be following here and talking about here on the show, obviously. But guys like Jake Livingstone, Sam Malinsky, even Ryan McAllister, a lot of these guys are playing on pretty strong teams. So I'd expect this to maybe drag on a little bit with the Frozen Four starting at the start of April. That's about as long as it can go. So the latest an NCAA player will become a free agent as they're turning pro will be April 8th, I believe is the final day. But I've kind of said, and for everybody here checking out the show live on YouTube or listening in the podcast, just so you know, it's going to be a game-by-game thing. When teams lose and they're eliminated, that means their NCAA season is over, and the guys that want to go pro, they can go pro. But technically, as of today, the regular season in the NCAA is over. So for players that do not have playoff games, they can sign with NHL teams. You might even see a signing today. You could see a signing today of a bad team with a good player. So we'll see what happens moving forward, and we'll absolutely keep you guys updated when there is kind of a big name that is becoming a free agent because their season's over. So we'll keep you guys updated on that. Anything that you think about kind of the Canucks being, I saw JD had a tweet today talking about he thinks the Canucks are going to be very active on the market. That's what he's heard. I've heard some similar things about certain players. So I'm curious to see what they do here over the next little bit. They got 6 contract spots right now.
Yeah, they need to, because pushing soon, right? Trying to accelerate things with the retool, because the last administration left them with a pretty crappy prospect pool, and because they've now had to start trading picks as well. they're going to be at a deficit, right? So they're going to have to look at non-traditional avenues in terms of bringing in talent that can hopefully help you on entry-level contracts, even if it's in some depth roles, plus how much they've invested in their player development staff. Abbotsford, that clearly leads you to believe that they're trying to make that part of the pitch to bringing some of these guys in. So absolutely, I'd expect them to sort of be active in this sort of chase, Europe, all the sorts of things, just like they were active more on the European side last year.
Yeah, and I think this year, just because of like a weird year prior with COVID, I think that this is a very good NCAA free agent class. I'll say that from a lot of the players that I've seen, a lot of the reports that I've read, a very big year for NCAA prospects. Not as much for Europeans, I don't think, actually. I think the European free agent class is pretty weak this year, actually. So we'll have to see what happens. By the way, I might have forgotten off the top, Alex Allard, our producer, I might not have mentioned him off the top. Alex, how have you been today? We're running late, so you might not be as happy as I was hoping. How are you, Alex?
No, it's all good. Yeah, I did note. I wrote it down here. You did not mention me off the top, but that's fine.
Is it in your burn book or what? Where'd you write it down?
Yeah, it's just in my show notes here. We'll just take an extra couple minutes to get on YouTube next time, maybe.
Oh, goodness gracious. Oh, man, we're going to be firing up at 1:40 tomorrow, folks, so make sure you're by for that. Alex, you've done a good job today. Not a lot of graphics, though. I gave you a pretty light day. So, yeah, I got to mention Alex there before we get to the end. All right.
It's nice.
And
it's nice having no graphics. Harm's here, he doesn't like graphics.
All right, Alex, I want to close the show out, but what do I have to do first? There it is. See? Look at this guy. Producer extraordinaire, Alex Allard. All right, let's get to our Betway bets of the day as we wrap up here. The Vancouver Canucks, they're in action tonight against the Nashville Predators. Canucks and Predators, 7:30. We talked about it tonight. Really good odds on this one. Anthony Beauvillier or Brock Besser to score a goal in tonight's game, -110. So a $10 bet's going to return you $19.09. What do you think? You getting a goal from Beauvillier or Besser tonight?
Beauvillier's family's in town.
Bingo. Hammer it, folks. $10 bet will get you $19.09 over on Betway. And then the second one, the Predators to win over 6.5 total goals and JT Miller to score a goal in the game, +750. A $10 bet that's going to return you $85 over on Betway.
Sorry, what was that again?
Betway. There it is. All right, we'll wrap things up there for our producer, Alex Allard, my co-host, Harmon Dial, who thank you for filling in on a Monday, Harm. The folks at Zephyr Epic, they'll get you some hockey cards, and we'll use half our budget to pay for you to come in on a Monday. Because do you charge overtime on a Monday? Is that the deal?
No,
you're going straight across. Okay, fair enough.
It's puppy duty. You can't. You gotta understand, right?
You understand it, but what's the trade off here? Did Quad say you come over and see the new puppy, or what's the deal? Is there some sort of side deal on that?
I'm just not coming Friday. I'm like, I need that day off. I've been on every podcast show possible the last 2 weeks. So
you're just riding the wave right now.
I know.
Right?
I have Vancast tomorrow too. So once I'm done that, I'm glad to have a bit of a break. Or
Wednesday is one
people
of those
are probably
days.
sick of hearing me.
You're gonna take that Yeti mic and just chuck it into the wall on Wednesday. All right. Well, Harm, I appreciate you dropping by here on a Monday. So yeah, Quads is gonna be back tomorrow, as far as I know. His puppy may be in the background as well, or if people in the chat really kind of hype him up when the show starts tomorrow. Everybody, if you're watching, I don't know, maybe the dog will make an appearance on tomorrow's show because he is a cutie. That's for sure. I've already seen a lot of it. So that wraps it up here for my co-host Harmon Dial, our producer Alex Allard. My name is Chris Faber. Thank you so much for tuning into another episode of the Canucks Conversation. There it is. Look at this now.
Thanks for listening to Canucks Conversation. Hit the subscribe button to never miss an episode.
How about keep it to a thank you, Jim?